Oh, my latest little excursion in reading, and I really enjoyed this, is Pope Joan, a novel by Donna Woolfolk Cross. Now, I was aware of the legend of a female pope, known as Pope Joan, for quite some time. And so when I saw this, I was like, oh, that's exciting, you know? And didn't expect a whole hell of a lot. It's a historical novel, after all. Usually authors take a great deal of liberty, and she does. She does. I won't disparage that. For example, some historical dates are shifted around just to make the story more exciting or something. I don't know. For example, a Viking raid is moved like, I don't know, 40 or 50 years into the future or something like that for what seems to me to be very limited purpose. But anyway, I find it particularly disturbing when really known facts are shifted like that. However, the author does make a strong case for within notes that are actually contained in the back of the book. First of all, notes that are contained as footnotes that are repeated here, where they're much more readable. My glasses had real trouble with the footnotes, and then I realized I'm just rereading them when I got back here. But also some dissertation, from her research about the likelihood of there being a Pope Joan as a single sort of essay. It's basically, she's taking the statement, and I'm trying to remember who it was who wrote it, but this is a 9th century pope, a late 9th century pope, between Sergius the Third, I think, and one of the Bonifaces, yeah. But anyhow, the date was set for when this pope's reign was, and much of the story of the pope, as at the earliest indication that we have of it is 1099. So, you're talking about a 200-year difference, which is about the missing, a little bit more than the missing time present in, say, the story of Islam, when it comes down to it, which I find terribly a disturbing thing, but the facts that are related are kind of impressive in terms of their specifics. And then there were also well-documented and accepted cases of women in positions as high as a bishop. So it's not completely beyond the pale that there was a female pope, or maybe more than one. The big deal about this particular one is that she had a miscarriage in the middle of a street, and I tend to be very, very pleased and very receptive to stories which go against the accepted doctrine and histories of various religions. So, for example, I flirt with the idea that Jesus was not an historical person, that and more evidence is coming out on this, that Mecca was not Mecca, and that Mohammedanism was actually a sect of either Christianity or Judaism that shifted rather than a bunch of pagans who took up the religions of the book. And things along those lines. And you can take that however you like. I was also always intrigued by things like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which is essentially the, what's his name, Dan Brown or whatever. I can't even remember the name of his book, which basically used Holy Blood, Holy Grail as if it was gospel, behind it all. When Holy Blood, Holy Grail was written, it was written as a hoax, or as part of a hoax. Well, it was caused by a hoax, which to me, I thought it was written kind of like the Illuminatus was, taking lots of historical stuff and making shit up. But then when you get deeper into the book, it's like, they're like finding stuff in the library and then the stuff's disappearing and stuff like that. And it's starting to, sound really bogus, right? Unlike those, though, I feel like the scholarship behind the background that she's done here seems rigorous. I don't think, in her essay, I don't think she makes a good enough point as to pushing all the opposition points very well. She's definitely got, an agenda in terms of pushing forward her historical view, and I don't think adequately represents alternate views. But that's okay. That's not what what it's about. What it really comes down to is spinning a tale in which tons of stuff is going to be completely made up. Because unlike a lot of sort of historical novels that deal with historical figures or whatever, this is one where at best there's just tiny little scraps here and there of information, and in some ways maybe she fits the main characters, and primarily Joan herself, as being a little too involved in too many things. But on the other hand, there might be an argument of, well, how would she become Pope if she wasn't, because we're talking about someone who was not from the Italian nobility, the Roman nobility in particular, which is where most of the popes were coming from at that period. Unfortunately, it doesn't get tied together in a way that it's like nicely linked, and part of that is because there's basically nothing that really pushes forward in the history why this John de Anglius or Anglicus was made Pope, and it's just sort of related that some female became Pope and then was stricken from the chronologies as soon as possible, was almost immediately stricken because it was just such a horrible thing. Now, in terms of arguments against, there are actually stronger arguments against them were presented. Such things as opponents of the church not bringing the scandal up at all. There's nothing contemporaneous for it. And in fact, some other scholars have tried to place the Pope Joan story in a much later period. Before that 1099, but like around 1066, somewhere in that range. For whatever, however you want to put it. But in terms of a story itself, I found it enjoyable enough. When I found my suspension of disbelief was failing, but largely around matters that she does actually cover in her argumentation for why this is actually a plausible situation. So, as I started getting into the later part of the book and seeing some of the footnotes and whatnot, I became less skeptical about, not so much about the existence of Pope Joan or whatever, but just about the believability of the story no matter what. But again, it's really working almost whole cloth fiction to get a couple of pieces of information connected together to get her there. Now, unfortunately, like I said, they have her involved in stuff. For example, the dipping of the bread in the wine. She's almost directly implicated in that. But that has nothing to do with her rising in the church or anything. So it's kind of like, yeah, you made her do something important and kind of exciting, but it doesn't actually impact anything. And that's kind of like, yeah, okay, it takes a realistic view of the medieval era, I think, in the sense that, you're not given that sort of Ivanhoe chivalric type feel or whatever. It's much grittier and uglier and more suitable in terms of believability that way, which is good. I often find those earlier romances are like, yeah, okay. But yeah, I mean, she makes an argument for like, well, lots of people kind of believe in King Arthur, but there's a lot more evidence or a lot more believable evidence for Pope Joan than there is for King Arthur. And yeah, that's true. And actually she makes the argument that there's as much evidence as there is for an actual Jesus. And that the time period between when someone writes something down is about the same amount of length of time. And you can make the same argument again with Muhammad. Although I'm more, I tend more towards believing that there was a historical Muhammad for various reasons. Maybe nothing like, what's represented at this point, or, within a couple hundred years. But that there had to be some kind of leader there, right? That was moving the whole faction forward. And that person might as well be a Muhammad. That's a very different situation to the Jesus story, which is like, ties in too well. Too much of it ties in too well to prior myths and to trying to fit things. And there's certain things that one could argue tie into a celestial being. I know Richard Carrier argues that. I am less than convinced by that argument. That would actually be a serious nail against a historical Jesus. Not, some sort of absolutism, but something that makes it much, much more likely that, oh, look, that story is basically being copied from the Old Testament and then being translated into an earthly realm instead of the celestial realm, and what's up with that? It's not as clear as some of the mythicists tend to try to put it, as far as I can tell. And again, everybody who makes an argument in this has kind of a horse in the race of one sort or another. So it's like, yeah, and I don't have the knowledge to, read the ancient Greek or worse, the Hebrew or Aramaic, in any case. But anyhow, in the case of this, I found that it spun an interesting story, one that I enjoyed quite a bit, and I found myself reading this voraciously. In a way that recently I read a couple of things. Well, I read the Stephen Ambrose history on the railways pretty voraciously, but I had nothing else I could do it during that time. That was when I had no electricity, and then when it came to, hey, regular life intervened, I slowed down quite a bit. But with this, I felt like, I just really, really wanted to eat it up, and was enjoying the writing and the story that was presented, kind of knowing that it was going to go badly, even though I didn't know all the sort of history of the situation. There's an interesting thing, because there was actually, this is really disturbing, there was actually a statue of the Pope that she was supposed to be in the Vatican, and the face got changed into a different, I think a different Pope, and Pope John the 20th, I think, changed his numeral to 21st. But again, this was later. Basically, there was like a period where the Catholic Church more or less accepted that this Pope existed. And then later on, revised their position on it. And in fact, the argument against it is that it was kind of it was something that Reformationists ended up, or reformers, or whatever you want to call them, ended up creating as a story. But it predates that by far. Now, obviously, there were heresies and whatnot, but it seems to have been accepted doctrine within the church at one point or another, and then withdrawn. The thing is, it was not included in the earlier histories, and she has kind of a way of finessing that in the story itself, and finessing why it shows up again anyhow, which is that it's put as an addendum in some other document, and that may actually be the later, the first actual representation, but I'm not sure. But yeah, it was a very enjoyable read for me, and a subject matter that I'm intrigued by and drawn into, even though I didn't really expect to, and don't feel like I learned a hell of a lot about the history. It's a period that's sort of post-Charlemagne, Carolingian period, that I find incredibly interesting. And there is, I'm also very interested a little later than that as well, sort of the Ottonian period, and then beyond that even. But just the mechanisms by which the Holy Roman Empire kind of existed in those times, and how it was resurrected by the Ottonians, essentially, because the title basically went out of existence. And some of the interesting relationships between the papacy and these Carolingians is actually well handled within this. although again, she plays around with dates. So for example, she has Lothar visiting Italy at a time when he did not. He actually sent his son there and stuff like that. Okay. Other dates she nails down perfectly fine. I don't really know, story-wise, like I don't see a terrible reason for any of the historical changes she made. I'm presuming she thought it made a better story that way, but yeah, that kind of disturbs me. But the nice part is she owns up to them completely. Now I had detected a couple of the inconsistencies with sort of like, yeah, that doesn't seem right. That's not what I remember. But she owned up to what little that I noticed, along with other things, and spelled them out, and why, not why she made the choices, just that she made them. And I find that a little weird. It's kind of like with designer's notes, like people's, when a designer says, I chose this, yeah, but why? You know, kind of give me some flavor into that. So it felt a little weird to not be given that. But on the other hand, I'm not used to authors defending their historical, you know, distortions. So I actually found it very positive that there was any kind of argumentation, both in terms of why it was why it was sort of believable and whatnot. That I see as more likely. Like I could see, a Dan Brown making these arguments based on, say, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and all kind of questionable research type stuff that spouted from the initial scam there. But also, but not stepping in and saying, but actually, I made this in this story, but actually it was this and stuff like that. I couldn't see him making that kind of argument in there at all, and so it was kind of refreshing to see that. But beyond that, it was an enjoyable read. It was a good story, one that you knew is going to turn out badly, but you keep hoping it's not. I don't think I would feel this way. So like, there's always hope in this, okay, of some sort or another, which is very different from like something like 1984, where you know it's going to turn out badly, and then it just depresses you all the more when it actually does. Like, there's something that seems okay about hope being distorted and turned and destroyed, but something that doesn't seem okay about hopelessness being confirmed. And I turn to my own existence there, right? Where I'm sure to some of you all, it seems like I'm hopeless, right? In my own. But there is always glimmers. There's always, and I consider it, foolishness, irrationalism, but there is always some sense in me, some wishful thinking perhaps is all it is, that I will not end up just living for, another 30 years or something, slowly degenerating worse and worse, and watching, and suffering through misfortunes again and again, that either I will find something good, or that, I'll come to a quicker end. But, the latter seems more likely, but I don't know. I really don't know. But instead, the most likely is, of course, the misery of existence that lasts way too long. But yeah, the fact that there's hope there, the fact that there's, it just makes it easier to push through. You don't feel like it's just absolutely predestined, and especially since good things happen. Quite a bit of good things happen, and in fact, the bad stuff. Well, there's bad stuff that happens throughout too, but sort of the worst of it all kind of comes all at once. Anyway, yeah, I found myself really, really happy and intrigued that there was this historical discussion at the end of it. It's also sort of a book club discussion thing in it. And I looked over, the topics for that, and I don't know who the fuck comes up with these, but it just felt like, I don't know, it felt like a fifth grade teacher trying to, put something together to get their kids to discuss something. It just felt like if you had read the whole book, there would be so much more interesting topics to bring up than what they did. But it just, I don't know. And it's kind of the kind of crap that I imagine that most book clubs actually are like, is where you can take a look at some of these. Let's see. Just to give you do you think there really was a Pope Joan? There's a beginning to each of these questions. They fill out a little bit more, but how important is it that she existed? What do you think the lessons are? One about priests and nuns relaxing the restrictions on women in the church hierarchy. How do you think this should fit? Look, that's kind of an interesting discussion. I don't feel like it really has a hell of a lot to do with this book, and with at least what I brought of interest to it. I think it has a lot more to do, it's only even really relevant if you're in a Catholic society, I would think. I don't know. They just feel like such leading questions. And then there's things like, according to the author, Joan's story was universally known and accepted until the 17th century. Why do you think that changed? That's not exactly what she said. The common acceptance was between the 12th century and the 16th century. It's not at all clear that it was accepted before the 12th century. There's no indication that it was. There's no evidence, nothing, not even a scrap from that time. But again, there's not a scrap of Islamic writing. I'm trying to think how long the period it is. I want to say something like 160 years, about the same kind of time as this. But it appears there that something really big was being removed, changed. Something really important was underway there that had to be completely eliminated. But anyway, I don't know. It just felt like those kind of questions are just such bullshit to me, and that one could come up with a lot of really interesting things to discuss about this book. If you're looking at a book club type thing, why did she change those dates? Why? What literary value was to that? Because to me, that's what a book club is about, right? The literary choices, rather than, these kind of, I don't know. Maybe not so much, maybe they're looking at it more as a non-fiction type thing. But it's very clearly purely a work of fiction that that is based on what's seen as an unlikely, by most scholars, an unlikely situation as its premise. Anyway, I enjoyed it. I don't know if I'm going to keep this, simply because I kind of feel like there's not a lot. Like, I don't think I'll enjoy it as much on a second reading. I feel like enough of it will be locked in. On the other hand, I had enough fun with it that there's also the problem of, I just picked up 3 more books today. And I read one, in the time period. And it was like, I can't keep up when there's these little free libraries with the interesting stuff that I find. And I could have picked up a whole fucking set. There was a whole set of Robert Jordan, a whole series. I don't think of it. I don't know. I thought he was the Wheel of Time guy, and it wasn't that. It was something else. I think. I don't know. Maybe I'm mistaken. But it was a whole pile of them, like 8 or 9 books. I'm like, well, I'm taking these 3 that I grabbed, not this one, but three other that I grabbed. And I'm like, can I really grab like a dozen books out of the damn thing at once? Like, if there had been just a couple from the series, I would have grabbed them with no problem instead. But given that I was pulling a few books anyway, I was just like, maybe I'll leave them there for somebody who really likes his writing. If it's who I think it is. It was clearly fantasy stuff or something of that nature. So, all right. I'll send this one up.